Okay, good morning. This is the House Appropriations Committee. It is Tuesday, February 25th, 2025, and we are continuing our tour of the FY26 budget. And this morning, we're delighted to have with us the State Board of Education. We have the chair of the board, Jennifer Samuelson, and another colleague, and I'm sorry I can't reach. Oh, it's Tammy's here. Okay, Tammy Colby's here. You do look familiar, Tammy. I remember you from when I was in Ways and Means years ago. So welcome. You have not been to our committee before, so we will introduce ourselves and then we'll ask you to introduce yourselves and talk to us about the SBE. So Dave.
Good morning. I'm Dave Iacoboni from Morrisville, and I represent the Lamoille, Washington district. Welcome.
Good morning and welcome. I'm John Kosenska from Burke, and I represent the Essex Caledonia district.
I'm Mike Nigro. I represent Bennington and Pelham. Tom Stevens from Waterbury, representing the Washington Chittenden district.
Good morning, Jim Harrison from Chittenden, also represent Mendon, Killington, and Pittsfield. Welcome.
Hi, Robin Chai from Middlebury.
Tiff Bloomley from Burlington.
Trevor Squirrel, Underhill and Jericho.
Wayne LaRush, I represent Highgate, Franklin, Berkshire, and Richford.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm Jennifer Deck-Samuelson.
We got two more to go.
Oh,
Hang on,
I'm sorry. Trying to go around the table. Sorry.
Good morning. I'm Mike Marwicki, and I represent Wyndham 4 District of Putney and Dummerston.
Hi, I'm Lynn Dickinson. I represent St. Albans Town.
Now we're done. Please introduce yourselves. Thanks.
Sorry. Jennifer Deck-Samuelson, Chair of the State Board of Education, and I'm joined this morning by Tammy Colby, the Vice Chair of the board. Thank you all very much for having us in today, especially on short notice. We really appreciate it. And I believe that you have received a copy of the February 14th memo that we sent to House and Senate Ed detailing our budget requests, which is basically broken down into 3 buckets of work.
Hang on one sec. Do you have something there? No, apparently we don't.
Oh,
Okay.
well,
I'm just looking at, no, so if you can send it to Erin.
okay. Let me do that. Erin, if you don't mind, what is your email? I'm going to write it down.
She will email you and give it to you. And
Okay,
then
perfect.
if you have it, can one of you share screen until we get it ourselves? Do you have the document? Tammy, you could, who can do that? And
I have it before it went on letterhead. Jennifer, I think you have the one that's official.
Okay, let me, and I'm really sorry. I had thought that this had been forwarded to you.
Thank you for understanding.
Yes. I'm just literally scrolling through my email.
While Jennifer works on finding the memo, I could find a little context. Would that helpful?
Sure, that would be great.
I want to be efficient with our time. Jennifer, is that okay? Maybe we work on
I was
parallel.
going to suggest that, yes.
Okay, so nice to see you all. Tammy, for the record, Tammy Colby, Vice Chair of the State Board of Education. It's nice to see many of you, and I'm coming to you live from Plainfield, Vermont, since we've all introduced where we're from. So a little bit of context. Historically, the State Board of Education budget has been embedded in the Agency of Education budget. And that is a holdover from sort of the way the arrangement used to be, right? So prior to 2012, the State Board of Education oversaw the Agency of Education. And then after 2012, there was this fracture, and now the State Board operates entirely independently of the Agency of Education. However, our budget has been embedded in the overall agency budget. Over time, our budget has been reduced. As Jennifer will show you, right now we operate very much on a shoestring budget, even though we have primary responsibility for the rules, which govern the day-to-day operation of every single school district in the state. Historically, our budget has been around $70,000 a year, and it's been flat funded since 2023. We took a cut in 2022 down from 92,000. But in many ways, our budget really reflects, again, the work that how the board was doing its work prior to when it was overseeing the agency. So some things have happened since then. One, we no longer can rely on the agency for legal support. And the agency has determined, because we are separate entities, it means that there would be a conflict of interest for their attorneys to continue to help us, which is a challenge for us, since again, we are the regulatory body for the state's education system, public and independent schools. And so we are constantly bumping up against a cap of not having enough funding to have attorneys that need to help us both keep the rules updated, and I'll come to that in a moment, but also deal with the litigation and the kinds of things that we have to deal with, right? So we have statutory responsibilities with some sort of, as a hearing officer and dispute resolution. We also, because we have responsibility for the rules, notably the education quality standards and the independent school approval rules, you know, we need to manage some challenges to those and things along those lines. So this has created an ongoing situation, primarily
Tammy,
since
when did the agency of ed stop providing legal support?
a year and a half ago.
Okay.
And
Thank
let me
you.
just-
They had provided us with legal support up through the independent school rules, but they determined when it came to the EQS, the education quality standards, and the major update that we just did, that they would no longer be able to do that. So we have hired out for counsel and have independent counsel, and frankly, it's been a really great arrangement, and Jennifer can speak more to that. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The second thing to keep in mind is, since the split between the agency and the state board, we have a canon of rules, and many of them have never been updated, and they desperately need to be updated. Some of them have been updated more recently, the EQS and the independent school rules, but there are a lot of other rules. And some of those rules, again, just going back to the rules, are really what function. It's like that's what school principals and teachers actually rely on, school boards rely on when they're making decisions. So to have rules out of date and in ways that are inconsistent with existing statute or unclear in terms of guidance, or have references to a commissioner of education that doesn't even exist, right? And have some of these kinds of things, it really is creating a bit of a problem in the field. And so the state board has initiated an effort to undertake a comprehensive overview of the rules, to try to consolidate them, make them more efficient, but also modernize them so that the entire canon of rules is well aligned with existing statute. And as a
May I
part of
just
that
interrupt?
effort, yeah.
Are you seeing this memo? Because it says
Yes.
I'm hearing you are seeing it. Okay.
Yes.
Because I could only see
So,
myself.
Yep. So that's just, so it's really important that the rules get updated, right? And that is a core responsibility of the state board. We're ready to start that work immediately. However, we need legal support to do that. And of course, we can't rely on the agency to do that anymore. So what we would like to do, our budget request, so all of that by way of context for the budget request. And again, our request is trying to address some of these key challenges. But really, again, as the regulatory body for the state of Vermont and as an independent board, we do a lot of work with our constituents in the field. For example, around the EQS, we did a lot of work to make sure that that would be a rule that was both one that was implementable and reflected our values in the field. And we do a lot of that. You know, we took a negotiated rulemaking approach where we do a lot of work on sort of thinking about how the rule needs to look, even before we start the official ICAR, LCAR process, right, with the state. And that has proved very efficient, but it also has proven to build a nice consensus around the rules, and also making sure that the rules are implementable. So we want to make sure that that same process, right, and those access to the rules. I mean, we kind of think of ourselves as the public and public education. We want to make sure that the public has access to the rules, that we are able to make sure that the rules reflect the diversity of perspectives around the state on the rules, and also that they're implementable. That is different than a rulemaking process that's typically undertaken by an agency, which is relatively closed and formalized. So we very much want to maintain that process, and that's part of what we're requesting in our budget. So Jennifer, I tried to fill up the space. Did I get all the story, Jennifer? I'm trying to get all the story. Now let Jennifer go into the specifics.
So pause for a minute, please. So committee, it's now posted on our website, so you can pull it up if you want to take a look at it. You can keep sharing the screen, but we also have it so we can see it.
Great.
Great.
So
Okay.
I think if you're ready to sort of go down into the three buckets of our requests, I can kind of go through that. And so I'm looking at page 2 of the memo.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'll be honest, I don't even know if there is authority within this committee to give us a budget adjustment for FY25. That is the first request. And really that request goes back to Tammy's point about how the board currently does not have legal counsel. We are no longer able to rely on the agency. And at this point, because we do not have counsel on retainer, what that means is when we identify the need for counsel, we have to put it out to bid. And experience has shown that that's really about a 2 to 3 month process by the time we first identify a need for an attorney until we actually have an attorney on board that we are able to speak with about the substantive issue that gave rise to the need for the attorney. So you could imagine that there are times when we might want an attorney more quickly than that 2 to 3 month period. And it seems like best practice for us to be able to have an attorney on retainer so that when issues arise, which they do, we could literally pick up the phone, make a call, and receive a response. The other thing I would point out with that is when we are under contract with an attorney, that attorney is only able to help the board for within the parameters of that contract. So we might have an attorney on contract, but if we have another issue that comes up that is not the subject matter of that contract, we're still effectively without an attorney. So we really feel it's important to have an attorney on retainer. We've received an estimate that it would be $36,000 a year just to kind of have someone available to us and just kind of doing light work on issues that may arise. So the reason for the 18,000 for the second half of FY25 is that's literally, 36,000 divided by 2.
And so just so you know, the budget adjustment has passed out of the House and the Senate is voting on the floor today.
Okay.
There's other opportunities in sections, should we choose to go this route of the FY26 budget, there's a section that covers things in FY25.
Okay,
So,
great.
It wouldn't be in the budget adjustment bill, just so you understand that.
Okay, thank you. The second bucket of our requests is increasing the amount in our FY26 operating budget. And this would be, we're trying to sort of bring the board up to where it needs to be and then really take that amount and go forward in future years. So currently the board has been level funded since FY21 at $70,708, I think. That $70,000 and change covers the per diems for board members. It covers traveling expenses, advertising fees, media factory, recording and posting our meetings. It's basically the entire budget that the state board has to work with. And what we have discovered pretty quickly in the last couple of years is if we want to engage in rulemaking, if we want to really engage in any substantive work, there is not money in our budget to allow us to do that. So right now, we have our Student Performance Standards Committee, which is considering proposed standards that have been submitted to the board by statute by the Act 1 Working Group. And it would be really important for the board to be able to obtain a consultant to assist with this work because unlike other standards that the board has considered in the past, like Common Core, that are national standards that then are being implemented in Vermont, this set of standards is kind of the first of its kind. There's not a national counterpart. So to really do that work, we feel it would be important to have a consultant to assist us. We literally don't have money in our budget to retain an outside consultant. So much like the attorney, we don't have money in our budget. So looking at FY26, we are looking at an increase from the $70,708 that we've received since FY21. And that really breaks down into these 4 categories that you can see on the screen. One is we are seeking board member stipends of $5,000 per board member because we feel like the amount of time that board members commit to doing this work is really far in excess of the $6.25 per hour that we get by statute. So that's our first request. The second request is to obtain independent counsel to assist with updating our career and technical education rules, which have not been updated, Tammy, since I think they're 20 years old. Is that correct? It's been a while.
Yeah.
So that would.
And they need to be brought into alignment, right? So we've updated the education quality standards for public schools. We updated our independent school approval rules to make sure that those two things align, especially with respect to discrimination. And now we need to update the CTE rules, not just only to reflect changes in the CTE field and statute, but also to make sure that we don't have a situation where a child walks across the hall and there's a different set of rules that apply to discrimination and curricula on one side of the hallway and a different set of rules on the other side of the hallway.
Yeah, and those rules were last updated in 2002. So they do need to be brought into alignment with our other rules that govern education. They're also just dreadfully outdated. So that is the second bucket. So it would be $50,000 to update the rule series. And then that would also include the $36,000 to have an attorney on retainer to assist the board. The third category that fits into our FY26 operating budget is to reestablish the board's membership in the National Association of State Boards of Education. So the board dropped this membership a few years ago, in part because of the price tag. And again, considering that the board is living off of $70,000 and change, it was a lot of money for that total budget. And the board at the time decided to drop it. I think board members recognize now that there is a lot that comes from having that membership. At this point, we really don't have any other ability to communicate with other state boards and say, hey, how are you guys approaching this issue? What are some resources that you can share? It would really allow the board to think more broadly and comprehensively about the work that it's doing. So we've put in a request to reestablish our membership. And then the fourth thing is, I just mentioned this is the technical support for establishing the education standards, which goes back to the proposal that has been submitted to the board from the Act One working group. So that would give us money to hire a consultant to assist us with that work. So that is the FY26 operating budget. And then the final bucket is a one-time appropriation spread over a few years to allow us to update our rules. So as we mentioned, a lot of these rules have not been updated in well over a decade. A lot of the rules could be sunset. A lot of the rules probably don't even need to be rules, or they could be handed over to the agency as a regulation. But a lot of them are also in conflict with statute, which creates some confusion in the field. So we would really like to be able to update the rules so that, again, for instance, they still refer to the commissioner in many of the rule series, which always tells me that this is a rule that hasn't been touched for at least 13 years at this point. It's important for us to be able to do this work, but again, we can't do it on the $70,000 that we're living on at this point. So that's kind of the broad overview. And then what follows is kind of a proposed approach that the board might use to figuring out which rules to update, which rules to hand off to the agency, and how we would structure that rulemaking over a multi-year period. So I'm happy to answer any questions. And I can keep my screen up or I can stop sharing, whatever you prefer.
We have copies, so you're welcome to stop sharing, and then we can see you.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
Questions?
You too.
You look like you have a question.
I do. I'm just looking at the request for stipends. And I know last year, sitting on the Government Operations Committee, we took a good hard look at this because there were a number of requests. The first one was from I think it's the Commission on Native American Affairs. And what was brought up is that there's the $50 stipend per meeting, but there's a lot of work that goes into the rest of this, and I believe our committee supported it, but I don't think the administration did. And I'm trying to figure out if that changed or what the administration's position is on this. Do you know if the administration supports that request?
I did speak, and this goes back to the fall. There did seem to be some appetite within the governor's office for considering this. And as you all may know, Kendall Smith left the governor's administration, and she's now with Department of Labor. But she had suggested that she was going to look into other boards to see how they are funded. And I don't think that work was ever completed, unfortunately. I do know that there is a wide range, which I don't know if chronology is the easiest way to explain it, but there is a wide range between what some boards earn and what other boards earn. And so some boards, I know board members are, really earning a salary. This is not that. The other reason behind that request is I think it's important for the State Board of Ed to really represent a good cross-section of Vermonters with the experience that they could bring from the field to the State Board of Ed. But we also want people who would be able to do this work. And to your point, it is a lot of work. Each meeting is the tip of an iceberg, which, there are hours that sort of go into that meeting to be prepared. So when I think about who is able to take this job on for $6.25 an hour, it's not a very big pool. And I think, to the extent we want the State Board of Ed to represent a real, diverse set of, voices and perspectives, it would be helpful to have a higher stipend for board members, or to have a stipend, but to have it be something that really reflects the work that goes into being on the board.
I've got two folks, Rep. Harrison and Rep. Kasenska.
Yeah, I'm just looking for a response. And a few years ago, I also was on Government Operations Committee. And this is maybe 5 years ago now. But we had a summer committee that was looking at boards and commissions. As you might appreciate, the state has a lot of boards. And it raised a question of which ones were relevant today versus not relevant. And we don't do a very good job of sunsetting some of those. And so the summer committee had recommended that the Board of Education be sunsetted. It didn't pass. The Education Committee at that time said, no, not this. I'm curious as to, and I know we've gone through a transformation, but does it beg that question? Could this rulemaking and stuff be done through the Agency of Education or not? I'm asking, my sense is from what you're describing here is the administration continued with your flat $70,000 appropriation, which makes me think that it wasn't high on our priority list, but I don't want to read into what they're saying.
Yeah, that is a fair question. And I don't know if you were aware, but that is actually part of the governor's education transformation proposal, that it would include a shift of the responsibility for rulemaking, which right now is owned by the State Board of Ed, to the agency. And as far as, what I would say about this is that's really a philosophical question that I think the General Assembly is going to have to decide. But the agency has said, and there is merit to this, is that it would be more efficient and it would consolidate rulemaking with the agency that is responsible for implementation. What I would also say, and I think what the state board brings to this is, as Tammy mentioned, because the state board is required to have all of its meetings, open to the public. We take public comment at least once in every meeting, if not twice, once at the beginning, once at the end. We also have developed a process where even before we officially open a rule series, we gather input from the field so that we can really think about how these rules need to exist in a way that is implementable for members in the field. It's a very open and transparent process that we're not required to do. I think as the agency was given the responsibility for the district quality standards, it is not an approach that it undertook. So it's a different model. And I think it's up to the General Assembly to decide what level of transparency do you think is important for rulemaking to have? Because if it's about efficiency, the State Board of Ed model probably is not the most efficient model. But what we are is incredibly transparent and really careful to solicit that input through every step of the process.
Okay,
If I
thank
could
you.
add to that, I think the other thing to consider here is the capacity of the agency to actually make rules, right? So the CTE rule is over 20 years overdue, and the bifurcation of the state board and the agency comes way after that, right? Like, we have a canon of rules that no one has really updated in a very long time. And to Jennifer's point, like, there was one instance in the recent past where that rule was handed off to the agency. It was a very closed process. And it has created some issues in the field. But I think the other thing is that we already have an agency that's barely getting its job done on a whole lot of other fronts, right? And so where's the capacity to do this work? So if this needs to go, I mean, this really needs to happen. So if this is going to happen, somebody's got to pick up the ball, and it's got to be resourced. And it is unclear, I think, to us sort of how that would happen in the agency right now, especially given everything that's going on over there.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Representative Sensky?
Good morning. Thanks so much for sharing your budget here, and I completely understand wanting to provide a little bit more than $6.25 an hour to attend a board meeting. So a couple of questions. So I assume you probably meet monthly. Is that correct?
Yes, and I've for the last couple of years I've crunched the numbers. So in a 12-month period from December 23 to December 24, the board met 40 times, and that includes monthly meetings, that includes committee meetings, and we had a couple of special meetings. The year prior to that 12-month period was more than 60 meetings, because in addition to everything else that the board was doing, that was also when we engaged in the search for the Secretary of Education. So there were a lot more committee meetings and board meetings. So it does vary from year to year, but certainly more than one monthly meeting.
Yeah, I kind of assume that as well. And also, as you're looking ahead to capacity to get the work done that you need to get done here, would you be meeting more often than that? Would you be having to, think about other ways to organize your board to get the work done? I don't know what that would entail with, reviewing all the rules and to kind of make sure they're in step with statute here, but.
It would require definitely more committee meetings. And what we've done in the past is when we open up a rule series, we establish a committee that is primarily in charge with considering the updates and then bringing recommended language to the full board for discussion and a vote. So if we had 3 rule series that were open, we would probably have 3 different new committees that were created around each one of those rule series. So the committees, so again, you probably have 3 to 4 people on a committee. That's going to take up, every member of the board being on at least one of those committees. So yes, there would be additional committee meetings, and then the full discussion would happen at a monthly meeting of the full board.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that.
Rep. LaRouche and then Rep. Dickinson.
So you've been operating for quite a long time under the rules that exist now. So I'm in the context of all the potential changes that may happen if we reorganize our organizational system for education in the state of Vermont. And given the changes at the federal level in what may happen there, is this maybe premature to be looking at a change before all these things have come down? And then also, what's your intersection with the federal education folks? Do you have the same kind or a better intersection as what the Agency of Education has?
So Tammy, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. I think because of the changes that are anticipated, it's very important for us to be poised and ready to go. right? With modifying the rules. I spend most of my time doing federal work in my job. And so yeah, I work for a DC think tank where I'm heavily involved in federal work. And what I can say is that what will likely happen is that the feds are going to get out of education entirely, right? And there will be no sort of federal rules, right? It's going to all be state rules. And that we're going to have to think very carefully in this state about what it is we value and how we want that to reflect in our regulations, right? Like if you look at the policy proposals on the table, it is likely that Title I will go away entirely. And with that, all of the strings that come with that and the requirements for the state. That would leave us with IDA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. That likely will not go away in terms of its regulations, or at least some of the regulations. But the money will be entirely block granted where the state has broad discretion in how to spend it. And so we also have a competing lawsuit underway where we have a number of red states suing the federal government to basically wipe out existing protections for students with disabilities at the federal level. So the state will have to then make some choices. So I think what's going to happen here is that the table is going to get reset and the states are going to have to take an increasingly and intentionally so, right? That's the intention, is that the states are going to have to make up their own sort of frameworks and policy frameworks, regulatory frameworks, and that's going to vary from state to state. I doubt that we will have much. The feds are not going to be pulling our puppet strings in the same way that they are now. And the federal dollars will likely be going.
And to that, I would add, because we're also at a bit of a crossroads at the state level, as we think about roles and responsibilities being divided up between the agency and the State Board of Ed. You know, to an earlier point, I mean, it may be possible that the state board's roles are completely modified based on how the General Assembly determines to divide up those roles and responsibilities. But at the same time, we feel it's important to be able to present to you what we would like to be able to do and the money that we think it will require for us to be able to do that work. So that, you know, if it is decided that the State Board of Ed retains at least some rulemaking authority, then we'll have the funds to be able to engage in that work. So if we weren't here today and we weren't able to request additional money, even if we retained rulemaking authority, without more money, we wouldn't be able to discharge that duty. So it felt important. It's a little bit of a, you know, chicken and an egg problem that I think that we're having, but you know, we need the money to be able to do the work. And I think we're leaving it up to you guys to decide, you know, what does that work ultimately look like?
I think I'd like to make one other point if I could. The rules are the stable platform on which Vermont's education system is built. And there's a lot of noise out there right now. And so it's going to be really important that we keep the rules stable and that right, because it's school boards, principals, teachers aren't going to know how to do their job. And so we need to make sure that our rules are carefully thought out, that they provide clear implementable direction, and that they reflect input from the field so that we don't get into sort of these seismic shifts back and forth. Politicizing the rules is not good policy, right? The rules should never be politicized. The rules are the foundation on which our schools operate. And we may have political goals up here, right, in terms of policy shifts, but the bottom line is those rules have to remain relatively stable and they should not be politicized.
Thank you. Rep. Dickinson?
Yeah, thank you very much. Back in the late 80s and early 90s, I served as a trustee of an independent school. It was really a public school that had been set up with a trust, but basically all of its money came from state, local, and federal money. But we couldn't vote on our budget and we couldn't vote for our representatives. So we were appointed by the city council and the select board. I used to sit watch the State Board of Education meetings on Saturdays.
Lynn.
Which was like watching the paint dry, except that I realized
What a life you had.
I mean, 6 hours worth of that, and I would just sit there. I knew the people on it. I had actually testified in front of them trying to create this school into a union high school previously. So I used to sit there and watch it for fun. That's bizarre, but that's what I did. But anyway, since then, I've also served on a couple of boards. Representative Iacoboni and I both served on the Public Oversight Commission for the hospitals, during which time Fletcher Allen was going through its own transformation. We got paid $50 a day and a free lunch at the Capitol Plaza. And we probably put in a lot of time on that. And it was, it's still sort of the hospitals are still, and the healthcare system is still in a quagmire financially, but it was really looking pretty grim at that point. And I serve on a board now where we don't get paid anything. I serve for the Vermont State College Board as a legislative trustee. We find good people to serve who are committed because they believe in the mission of what we're doing. And I think that was very similar to the thing we did with the hospitals, just like, of course, the Vermont Care Board does that work now and they get paid a lot of money, but we did that for the $50 a day. I know it's hard to find people to serve, but I'm just wondering if bifurcation is really the correct way to go. I know that you used to appoint the commissioner, and now a secretary appointed by the governor, and I understand why that's the case, because there's more accountability. Previously, the commissioner had very little power to do anything. And I just look at all of these rules that you have to talk about. I mean, for someone who's been involved in education for a long time, I'm not really sure that I understand what the EQS is, and all these other rules that are listed here. And I certainly had a technical center at our high school, so I know that the CTE rules and the CTE situation and its financing is very complicated. I think I agree with Representative LaRoche that maybe we ought to wait and get this transformation situation started and then reassess where you need to go, because things may change. And I just really want to say that I appreciate your service. I know how hard this is. I've done it. But I just wonder if maybe we're just putting the cart before the horse.
And I think that's a fair question, because we don't know how the legislature is going to ultimately divide up the roles and responsibilities. I think everyone could agree that there was the divorce, if you will, that happened in 2012 between the board and the agency, but there's never been a split. And so what there has been for the last, going on 13 years is a fair amount of confusion. And I mean, I personally get emails addressed to me in my capacity as chair because people have an issue about their, kid in a school and they don't know where to turn. And oftentimes it's not the State Board of Ed. But then I figure out, who in the agency would be the right person and, direct them, the inquirer to the right person. There is confusion. And I think everyone feels that there would be a lot of benefit to have some clarity about the roles and responsibilities of the agency and the board. My only concern, and the reason why we're here today asking, for money for FY26 and beyond, is if we don't ask, and correct me if I'm wrong, because you know this much better than I do, but I wouldn't want the board to be given responsibilities and be expected to accomplish those on a $70,000 annual budget. Because I think what we have experienced the last couple of years is we can't do that. So I think, any responsibilities that remain with the board or that are given to the board, there needs to be money behind that to allow us to do that work.
You're asking us for $169,000 total budget between one-time and base, which is a lot more.
I'm sorry?
You're asking for an increase, a total of $559,000, which is both base and one time. And considering the fact that we're going through this transformation, I'm just wondering if it might be better just to wait whenever your duties are more defined and more aware of exactly who's going to do what. But thank you.
Thank you. Rep. Markey, I had a question.
Thank you. I just want to be clear that I'm not averse to the request that you're making. I don't doubt you deserve it. My concern is that if we say yes to you, don't we have to say yes to every other board that's come before us and asked for an increase in their stipend, their per diem?
Again, I don't know the level of work that other boards do versus what the State Board of Ed does. I don't have access to the data to be able to make those comparisons. I can tell you what the State Board of Ed does and the amount of time that we spend outside of meetings and certainly in meetings to do the work that we do. So again, I don't know where on that spectrum we fall. I just know that, there's the one end of the spectrum, which is, the $6.25 an hour. And then there's the other end of the spectrum where there are boards where board members are making six figures. So
Jennifer, I don't have the
Sure.
number in front of me. Can you remind me how much we spent already each year? Right, so I think we have to be careful, right? The budget request is for $50,000 for stipends, but we're already spending quite a bit of money for the $50 per meeting, right? So you take 60 meetings times 10 people times $50. I just want to be careful about like that $50,000 feeling like that's an increase, because that's not, right? We're already spending a good share of that. And there's also administrative costs to the agency or whomever does this. We're having to process all of these monthly for 10 people reimbursement requests, right? So, I mean, I don't remember what the delta is. So the increase isn't $50,000, right? We're asking for $50,000, but I forget, Jennifer, do you know what we spent last year? I think we had nearly 20 in there.
for actual FY24, we spent just about 13.5 on per diem. Per
Okay.
diem.
And I don't think everybody has requested that.
Most board members don't, because the issue is it worth $6.25 for me to submit a request for reimbursement?
I think we've been averaging around 15 to 20, right? In terms of how much if we sort of lag it back. So just to be, I'm not disagreeing with you. It is an increase, but I want to be clear. It's not a $50,000 increase, right? Like we already, right? Some of this is already, we need to consider the net.
Great. Rep, are you set, Mike? Rep Stevens? Okay.
I think this is a much larger conversation, and we've had it again and again over time. Paying people, or I don't know if paying is the right word, but having $50 plus mileage perhaps for this kind of work across the spectrum, to your point. While there's a tradition in Vermont to say, well, you're volunteering your time to sit on this board. And in the case of education, you're trying to create, and always have tried to create, and I haven't had to pay attention for the last 13 years, except from the outside, just to see the differences. And there is important policy decisions that get made at the board level, and they are political in some respects, but I admire the fact that you're trying. The Board of Education to me the State Board of Education to me has always been trying to be non-political, and I get that. The difficulty I have with any reimbursement to any of these agents, any of these boards that we have, it becomes elitist. You have to be able to afford to be on that board. You cannot, and we heard this with the Land Access Opportunity Board. We've heard this over the last few years, where if you're asking somebody to take a day or 12 days out of their lives, $50 a day plus mileage isn't going to cut it for people who have bills to pay. And so, keeping it, I don't know that $5,000 is, it seems reasonable for the fact that you're a board that is trying to help shape a $1.5 billion enterprise from all four corners of the state. I think people need to be compensated for their intellectual and physical time to try to make that right. So I'm, without saying I support this notion of what you're asking for, I think it's worthy of the conversation because it's putting into a spotlight the fact that we're asking people from across the state at so many different levels to participate in our government and try to provide guidance for pennies. on their time. And I think that in the end, for the work that you're doing is disrespectful. People should be compensated for the time. People should have the choice to volunteer, for sure. But it's a larger conversation. I agree. There's a lot of boards that we just have a $50 a day. Thanks so much for your time. Might as well be a gift card to, wherever. But it's, at this point, with inflation, with time inflation, and with what you're being asked to be participating aside with, I don't find it an unreasonable request, but I also can appreciate the fact that, come one, come all for that kind of, that kind of compensation. But I don't think that the argument for me is about whether your time is worth this much. Your time is worth more than $5,000 a year for the work that you're doing. And I think that's important to acknowledge and also understand we're a tiny little state. So can we afford? But I think it's worth it because for the fact that you're not politicizing, you're trying, at least the board is trying to not be political about the standards that they're setting for student learning, for teacher behavior, for administrative behavior across the board, and that's much appreciated. So thank you.
Well, and thank you for
To Jennifer's earlier point, right? I think we can recognize, I think it sounds like we've bumped into sort of a larger question around board compensation, and certainly I think all of the arguments being made are fair on all sides here. I just want to point out that the most substantial part of our budget request is for legal counsel. And that is something that is really important because we no longer have access to counsel. And we are, at least, and I understand we have governance, we may have governance changes, but from now until when those governance changes occur, the State Board of Education is still responsible for the rules. We still have statutory responsibilities where at times we have to be hearing officers, right? That we have things that we're required to do under the current statute, and we don't have counsel, right? And that's a big deal. And it's going to be a bigger deal, I think, as the world becomes more unsettled with respect to where the federal government may happen and the kind of legal challenges that we could face on our existing rules, right? The education quality standards have significant protections in there for students with respect to discrimination, right? And it is likely that we will feel that we may encounter challenges to those. So I appreciate the discussion about the compensation. It sounds like this is a much larger conversation and one that it sounds like the state should have. But I do want to make sure that we're also sort of noting that the most substantial increases that we have in our budget are around having counsel and access to the National Organization of State Boards of Education, who are going to be wrestling with these really important tensions, right, that are going to be flowing down to the state. And until we have governance change, that stuff still falls on our shoulders. Right. And so I just want to sort of raise my hand on that too, because that is really, I mean, of the increase that we're asking, those are the issues those are the resources that make up the lion's share of our request.
Thank you, Rep. Dickinson, and then.
Yeah, I just want to say, just to clarify that I don't want to focus on the reimbursement because that's really a very small piece of what you're asking for anyway. I just want to point out that you're not alone and that the importance of what you do is not unique. My real issue is that this is a timing issue. It just so happens we're doing this huge transformation that may or may not even have. We don't know how it's going to sugar off. You don't know how it's going to sugar off. In addition to the federal stuff that's all going on, Title I and all these things, the CTEs, all this federal money and block grants, all that is something that we don't know how that's going to change. So that's my concern, is it's the timing. I understand the need for legal counsel and you to continue to do your work until this is all finished. But, I just want to point out that you're not alone. We all know, we understand how that works. But
I would say worst case scenario. I mean, like let's say that the legislature decides to dissolve the State Board of Education. I would still argue that we would need legal counsel to help us wind up our affairs. And at this point, we don't have anything. So, and hopefully, that wouldn't be the ultimate decision, that there will still be a room for the State Board of Education. And even in the governor's proposal, there is a modified, but nevertheless, there is a role for the State Board of Education in that proposal. So, whether we disappear completely, take on new responsibilities, give up other responsibilities, or take on, a lot more responsibilities, I think the common thread there is that we will need legal counsel for any of that.
To finish up. All right, so I'm going to keep this going so we can finish up Rep. LaRouche and Rep. Blumenauer.
So I'm a little, I've been involved with the rulemaking process in the past. And so do your rules go through ICAR and LCAR and all the way through that process?
Yes.
And how does that intersect with the Agency of Education? Not at
Agency of
all.
Education cannot provide counsel to us for the ICAR LCAR process.
So how do you submit your work to LCAR and ICAR and get it through the process?
So
Without-
until 2022, we did have the ability to rely on agency counsel. But then, I'm an attorney in my day job. I understand why it was problematic for the agency to be assisting the board because we are a different entity. So the agency stopped that practice, and it really put the onus then on the board to retain legal counsel to assist us. So that's what we did in 2023 and 2024. And I will just mention, with our legal budget, we had a surplus from prior years that we were able to roll into FY24 to be able to pay the attorney for the work that was done, because we didn't have enough money in our FY24 budget to pay for that work. So we were able to, borrow, well, not borrow, take a surplus that we'd had from prior years.
So
For FY,
I'm asking about the process, because the process that I've always been involved with, you had an agency commissioner or a secretary that was part of that process. You had a board, and the board did its work. And then whatever was coming out for rulemaking went through the process, going to LCAR and ICAR, and the attorney, the agency had either a secretary or a commissioner working as an executive officer that signed off on that. And then that agency council then submitted those rules to LCAR and ICAR and the Secretary of State before those all got done.
so that
Not like that?
it is not like that since 2022.
And we have the chair of LCAR sitting next to you, so you might have some thoughts on that too. I don't mean to put you on the spot, Trevor, but you maybe can talk to him about that. So, Trevor, do you have something?
I'm not sure that currently your process is any different in AOE in terms of rulemaking, because you just had a rule come to our committee around independent schools, and it went through the normal process.
So
I know
that-
process.
Yeah, and you are correct. Once we start the formal APA rulemaking process, we follow the statute just like any other entity would. I think what Tammy was talking about earlier is, before we officially open up a rule series and embark on that APA rulemaking process, the board's practice has been to take testimony from people in the field to be able to inform the draft that is submitted to ICAR, so that we've already done a lot of that work before we, are then subject to that 8-month timeline in the APA. And that has been a very transparent process because, again, all board meetings are open to the public. The contrast there is, and again, we only have, one data point to go off of, but when the agency wrote the district quality standards, which was a responsibility that was given to it by the General Assembly, all of the drafting went on, in private, and then the rule was sort of released to the public. So that's the part where the board's approach has been, I think, a lot broader and a lot more inclusive. And again, we're dealing with rules that affect every child in Vermont, with very, very, very few exceptions. So the education quality standards apply to every public school. as well as any independent school that elects to follow them. And then the counterpart are in our 2200 rule series that govern independent school approvals, where we've put those same requirements into independent schools that want to be approved by the State Board of Education. So there are far-reaching, extensive rules that we felt was, and the CTE rules would follow right along with that, where again, it's really important in the board's opinion to have a very transparent, inclusive process before we even get to the APA.
And the Act 173 rules for special education, the General Assembly created a commission, right? The Act 173 group, who actually did all that work with the state board as part of it before the rule ever entered the ICAR process. So the education rules have a long history in this state of having a participatory process prior to entering the formal APA rulemaking process. And I think that's for a couple reasons. And that's one, to make sure that the rules are implementable, and to get as much constituent feedback as possible, because again, they touch every single school district, every single child in the state. And there are a lot of contingencies, and it's really hard to work through all of that in a very short 8-month period of time with formal comment periods. So a lot of back and forth on that. The second thing is that we are the public and public education, and for better or for worse, people have strong opinions about what public education should look like in this state. And again, we're trying not to politicize the process where the rules are written behind closed doors and then unveiled, and then there's a limit comment process on that. State board has provided access to the rules and input to those rules, and we've gotten very strong input from the field over time, and we've been able to negotiate and develop consensus in the field around some pretty sticky issues, right? And we were able to do that in a way where the rule could move forward in a productive way through the APA process. But that was all handled. Those hard conversations, right? That really sort of managing and talking through this with all the constituents in the field, that was managed before the APA process commenced.
I've got another, go ahead, Wade.
My understanding is the APA process requires anybody making rulemaking to go through that public process. And so the Secretary of the Agency of Education was to propagate rules, and I would presume that secretary does have some authority to propagate rules. Then they'd have to go through the same kind of public process that you would as a board. So I'm not seeing, I have a disconnect here if you're suggesting that you have a public process and they wouldn't.
I think what Tammy and I are trying to explain is that once you formally initiate rulemaking, this starts an 8-month timeline through the APA. What Tammy and I are talking about is what the board has done before we even get to that formal initiation of rulemaking, is to take a lot of testimony from the field to inform the rules that are then submitted to ICAR, so that we're really kind of several steps ahead of the game, which allows us to complete the rulemaking in the 8-month period. But the other thing too is that our rules the board is open to the public. And so, as I said and Hal said, members of the public can see how the sausage is made. I mean, you've got committee members who are, wrangling with word choices and nuance and how this will have a ripple effect if we do this, what's the effect here? And we have members of the public who sit there and listen to us and make comment at the end of the meeting. That doesn't happen if you are not a body that is required to be open to the public. It just doesn't. So you can be drafting rules that are then open for public comment, and then you respond to the public comment, but that's a very, very different process.
So Trevor.
Yeah, I just a comment. The process that you're describing, in my experience with LCAR, is not atypical. And I think you're correct. If it's a complex rule, not a straightforward rule, agencies and departments go through this fact finding and public engagement, or stakeholder engagement is probably a better word for that, before you get to the APA process. So what you're suggesting is not atypical.
And that may be, we haven't seen it with the limited rulemaking that the agency has done.
Right. So that hasn't happened there. Okay. Great. Thank you very much for coming in at short notice. We appreciate hearing from you. I'm sure we could talk all day, but we have to continue with other testimony. And we appreciate the work you're doing, and we will see where we land on all of this. But thank you for coming in. We appreciate it.
Thank you for your
Thank you, and
time.
thank you very much for your questions. This is really
Great
clarifying.
question. Thanks.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
great. Take care. Bye-bye. We have public safety.